This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Okay, just one more person coming in there. I'm Robert Holland, and I was particularly pleased to be asked to chair a session on the view from the Mediterranean and the Caribbean, not least to see that they're getting some dedicated attention rather than being overwhelmed by bigger continental land masses. So there's that. There's also two analytical, or if you like, practical reasons why I think it's good. One is that the thing about islands, of course, is that you can often, in terms of assessing things, you can often see issues, legacies, or all kinds of questions summed up rather more clearly due to the very kind of intense drama of island life than you can see them in bigger places. And so I think islands are particularly useful, be they Caribbean or Mediterranean, in terms of assessing legacies of empires, of empire. And the other thing is simply, the Financial Times carried a piece on the Caribbean last week, or 2 weeks ago, quoted an IMF report about some Caribbean islands being on a knife edge. And my immediate thought was, well, that's true, of course, of some Mediterranean islands and societies. So the contemporary aspect in relation to debt, partial sovereignty, all other kinds of things, that contemporary context will probably feed into our assessment, people's questions and discussions today. So we have two speakers to take up that theme, and they're going to speak for 20 minutes each, and then we're going to have discussion, of course, and I'll introduce them both consecutively and very briefly, despite their very distinguished careers. And the first is Professor Henry Frendo, who did his degree in Oxford, his PhD, in the early 1970s. I know that bit of his CV is true because I was with him at the time. He then went on to work for the UN High Commissioner for Refugees in Europe and Asia and Africa, and then went into an academic career, taught in Australia, back to the University of Malta, where he became a professor in 1992, but also maintained a media and, to some extent, I suppose, a political career. Anyway, he became mayor of his hometown of Attard, and indeed was president of the Malta's College of Mayors. But the key thing for us is that he has a very broad Mediterranean interest. He's director of the Institute of Maltese Studies at the university, closely tied up with the Journal of Mediterranean Studies, and his most recent book is a magnum opus, Europe and Empire, Culture, Politics and Identity in Malta and the Mediterranean. So he has this broad Mediterranean engagement, and that's we're pleased to have him here today for that reason.
Well, I've been advised by my good friend Professor Holland to ad-lib, because I actually wrote this thing down, but I'll try to make the most of eye contact and voice projection without reading it out. I subtitled the talk, Language, Jobs and Governance. Now, Malta is somewhat sui generis in the context of this very interesting conference, because in addition to the imperial legacy, it also had a European legacy. And as a matter of fact, one of the main motivating forces in Maltese politics over the past 2 centuries has been the tension between Europe and empire. That is to say, here you had an empire which moves into a terrain which in some respects is not too dissimilar from it. For instance, the British in Malta found a university of studies, which I don't think they found in other parts of the empire. This was founded in 1572, which means that they had to put up with the locally trained, locally molded native elite, that is to say professional classes who belonged, appertained and felt strong affinities with their, obviously, with their island home. Now, this comes out particularly in the assimilation resistance paradigm, because the British took Malta and held Malta mainly for strategic reasons. Malta had and still has the best, largest deep water harbors in the Mediterranean, best sheltered, with various creeks, for those who are not familiar with Malta. So you could have the British Mediterranean fleet literally in the Grand Harbour. So this strategic dimension was always a conditioning factor on colonial policy. And the moment somebody in London or even in Valletta said, but Malta is a fortress colony, that was a statement of policy. It meant that, listen, you couldn't allow too many freedoms to a place which was essentially tantamount to being the deck of a man of war, which of course it wasn't. So the moment that the British, as soon as they came to Malta at the request of the Maltese insurgents during the anti-French uprising in 1798, 1799, they immediately were attempted to try to introduce English as the language of government and as the language of education. These were the instructions to the first governor from London. But of course, this didn't work, because Italian had been the language of education and of public life in Malta since the 14th century. Nobody understood a word of English. So as you can imagine, there was very considerable resistance to this attempt to anglicize the place. As time went by, and the British came to have more jobs in their gift, it became a matter of bread and butter to accommodate and to adjust and to some extent to assimilate as well. So the language question, which gives rise to Maltese political parties in 1880, after the unification of Italy, also becomes one of employment, of livelihood. Because clearly British policy was to encourage, to promote, and to reward those who could communicate with the British. And there are many areas in which this became increasingly important, particularly, perhaps, in the naval dockyard. Malta had this harbor, and the dockyards were expanded after the Crimean War, especially when Britain realized how more important Malta actually was than they had realized. Increased the garrison, started building docks, and so on. So you had a shift, a population shift, a demographic shift from the field to the wharf. And this population shift, of course, was also occupationally driven. So people moved from the farm to the harbor because there were jobs there which they could take. And obviously in that process, knowing English came to be more meaningful to them than knowing Italian. So various jobs were created in this process. Apart from which, somebody this morning mentioned infrastructure. In terms of infrastructure, I think the legacy of empire was quite considerable, actually, because you have a technology of modernity which is introduced partly because of the importance of shipping and maritime affairs. So you get the various stages of the modernity, really, in terms of in industrial terms, at least, with the telegraph, the telephone, water and drainage works, various types of innovations of that kind, which also meant more skills were required, more jobs were provided. You had, for instance, a technical school. The best technical school was the dockyard school, which could produce apprentices for the Royal Dockyard. So you had electricians, welders, you name it, thousands of people employed in the harbor and in the docks. Apart from all those people servicing the fleet, boatmen, ship chandlers, coal heavers, stevedores, warehousemen. So you have a culture, a dynamic of empire-related employment, which was also skills-driven, which required a new form of education, really technical education more than academic education, although there was, of course, the professions were still being produced by the university. The main problem, I think, was in governance, because the notion of the island as a nation with a people who aspired to autonomy was weak or dangerous to the imperial mind, because, of course, they saw this as a danger to the security of the fortress. So you have a constitutional history which has been described to a game of snakes and ladders. You eventually get a constitution in 1835. In 1839, you have, which is something very important, you have the abolition of the censorship, so you have a free press, which again is quite very positive and very important introduction. Then in 1849, for the first time, you have the introduction of the elective principle. So elections begin, people have the right to vote, a limited amount, a limited number of people, of course, subject to literacy, subject to property ownership, and so on. But when this improved constitutional status starts to operate, starts to function, there are clashes of priorities and of interests. So it's a trying affair. You have a struggle for representative government, which is basically a majority of elected members in the Council of Government, but then disagreements about who should pay for what, and disagreements as to why should Italian be eliminated from the education system or relegated to English. Why shouldn't they be taught together? Why shouldn't both languages be taught? And in fact, then representative government is abolished in 1903. It's restituted in 1921. It's suspended in 1930. It's restituted in 1932. It's suspended again in 1933. It's abolished altogether in 1936. Returned in 1947. Suspended in 1958. Returned in 1962, and then finally independence comes in 1964, but this is the snakes and ladders. So this is supposed to be a basic law, a constitution. So on the other hand, since there is this vague Westminster model, which is supposed to be, the mother country's forte, you have a kind of template to aspire to, obviously one which is not easily attainable in a colony, in a fortress colony, but nevertheless, this theory of the template, as I call it, I think had some effect, because if you look at how Malta developed in the long term, maybe looking at it too positively from a contemporary perspective, but it's a small island state. It attained independence. There was a smooth transition from colonialism to statehood in the 60s. The infrastructure, which in a sense was a continuation of that which had been initiated earlier in colonial times, developed further, because as an independent state, of course, you started having things which you wouldn't have dreamt of earlier, such as a central bank or a development corporation and so on. Basically, the economy has worked reasonably well. Today, it has diversified very considerably. Shipping is important, the maritime register is important, as aviation services, various other areas which have been taken on. Today, it's one of the best performing economies in Europe. Malta became a member of the European Union in 2004 and of the Eurozone in 2008. There's never been a coup d'etat. The parliamentary system has more or less worked. There have been difficult times in the 70s and 80s, especially in the Mintoff period. But the country wriggled itself out of these problems through opposition, of course, but this government-opposition dynamic dated back to the colonial period. And in a sense, it's a body politic which emerged from the government-opposition dialectic, almost. On the whole, looking back at the legacy of empire, it's not that bad. I mean, in terms of growth, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of skills, in spite of massive emigration, the country held and retained a viability which it still, I'd say it still possesses. So on the whole, there was this, I think, template which served Malta in good stead, and still does. Alternating succession has worked ever since independence. There have been changes, free elections, changes of government and free elections. The last one now on the 9th of March, when the Labour Party was returned by a large majority after 15 years in opposition in the post-Mintoff period. And hopefully the parties have learned something from each other, and the future doesn't look too bad.
Thank you, Henry. So that
we can deal with questions later.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll come back on that. Excellent on the time, that mixed history and contemporary affairs. I can tell you that Professor Frendo's views on empire have mellowed over time. But we may come back to that. But meanwhile, let's move on to Sir Ronald Sanders, who has had a distinguished diplomatic career spanning 30 years, twice High Commissioner to the United Kingdom for Antigua and Barbuda. But in between, he's also had a very active career in both the public and the private sectors, lots to do with organisations like OECD and CARICOM. He's had a strong Commonwealth dimension to his work over time, and he was part of the Eminent Persons Group, tasked in 2010 to report on options of reform for the Commonwealth. And he's also had an academic dimension to his life, and he's been a visiting fellow at Oxford and Sussex, I hope I get that right, and certainly currently a research fellow at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies. So there's a wealth of both Caribbean and international experience to bring to bear. So, Sir Ronald.
Well, thank you all very much. I must start by saying that earlier this week, I listened to a program called The Art of the Foreign Secretary, which featured the distinguished personage, Lord Carrington, whom we are privileged to have with us this afternoon. Lord Carrington made a statement that resonated with me because I shared it with him. He said that when he was growing up, most of the map was colored red. Well, that was so for me too, though I think we looked at that map with rather different perspectives. The problem is that it's fast becoming red again, though from a different country altogether. But the thing about that red, of course, is that that red was the British Empire. Another former British Foreign Secretary famously observed that when empires crumble, they tend to crumble exceedingly small. So it is with the British Empire in the Caribbean, now made up of 12 politically independent, small countries and a handful of even smaller overseas territories. Now, the legacy of empire in the Caribbean, if one is to be honest, is a mixed one. Some aspects are good, many aspects are bad, one in particular is ugly, and then there is the remarkable. Let me start with the good. The first is language. Because English has become the first language of international commerce, the legacy of the English language in the former British colony has been, as British colonies, has been beneficial to the English-speaking Caribbean countries in a range of global transactions. Its downside is that West Indians felt no need to learn Spanish and Portuguese, the languages of their larger region. I suspect we replicated that in Britain by not bothering to learn French, German, Portuguese, Spanish, and all the other languages that now make up the European Union. And we're not even going to get to Serbian. Now, with regard to institutions related to governance, I think it is fair to say that important legacies of empire were an established legal and judicial system, a functional public service, and at independence, written constitutions based on the rule of law and democracy. In many ways, these institutions, apart from the independence constitutions, were of course set up to serve British interests. The civil service is a particular example where the role of a colonial power group was to carry out the instructions of the British Colonial Office rather than to bolster policies locally devised by local officials. Indeed, a former Prime Minister of Barbados, Errol Barrow, described the civil service in the pre-independence Caribbean as an army of occupation sent down to the area by the Colonial Office. That is indeed how people felt about it. Nonetheless, independent judiciaries and legal systems and a functional non-political civil service were two important legacies of empire in the Caribbean. Independence constitutions with electoral procedures and representation based on the Westminster model are also a feature of the system of governance in the now independent former British colonies of the region, and in those that still retain association with Britain as overseas territories. It should be noted that until recently, the 12 independent English-speaking countries of the Caribbean retained the British Privy Council as their final appellate court. In 2005, 3 of those countries joined the Caribbean Court of Justice as their final court of appeal, and others are contemplating doing the same once the obstacles of entrenched constitutional requirements involving referenda can be overcome. The appropriateness of the Westminster model and its electoral system has also been questioned in many Caribbean countries, and more recently by the British government itself in relation to its overseas territory, the Turks and Caicos Islands. Nonetheless, the system has basically worked in these countries, although, unlike in Britain, it lacks robust checks and balances that would underscore free and fair elections, free and fair administration, free and fair supervision, and free and fair conduct. Looking at the larger question of education, basic education in the Caribbean, largely missionary-led, ensured literacy in English at an early stage. That meant that even from the 1930s, there were people coming up from the Caribbean to the United Kingdom to study at various universities. In the late 1950s, for instance, when Julius Nyerere of Tanzania was the only university-educated professional in his government, the Caribbean governments had graduates from Oxford, Cambridge, London, and you name it. Then in 1948, 14 years before the first English-speaking Caribbean country became independent, the University College of the West Indies was established in Jamaica to serve the region as a whole. It was established on the initiative of the post-war British Labour government, as were Makerere in Uganda and Ibadan in Nigeria. The university's second campus was established in 1960, 2 years before the independence of the first two Caribbean countries, Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago. There is no question that the establishment of the University of the West Indies, open to students from the entire English-speaking Caribbean in 1948, was a boon to the area. Albeit late in the day, it widened the opportunity for Caribbean nationals to take over for British colonial civil servants in a variety of disciplines and made them better able than many nationals of other British colonies in other parts of the world to manage the challenges of independence. Additionally, while the British education system was set up in individual countries to serve British colonial interests and was therefore narrow in its context, it was a solid grounding in basic education, sufficient for a region of just 5 million people to produce 3 Nobel laureates, 1 in economics and 2 in literature, and more recently for one to be awarded the coveted Queen's Gold Medal for Poetry here in Britain, just a few months ago. Additionally, Caribbean nationals have served and are serving in high capacities in Commonwealth and international organizations, in international business institutions, and in international courts of justice in a manner that is disproportionate to the small number of the region's population. Their accomplishments belies the doctrine of inferiority that underpinned the excuse for slavery and indentured labor in the Caribbean. But it should be noted that the basic and limited education system was not matched by industrialization or the building of infrastructure that could create employment or professional opportunities for the tertiary educated. As a major consequence of that, more than 60% of the region's tertiary educated people today live in Britain, Canada, and the United States of America. Their talents are not available to their native Caribbean. Now, if I may turn to the bad. One of the bad legacies in empire in the Caribbean was the concentration and production of one crop and one crop only, sugar. That and the non-industrialization of the economies. Sugar production for the benefit of British conglomerates remained the mainstay of many Caribbean countries even after independence. In the small islands of the Caribbean, Dominica, St. Vincent of the Grenadines, and Grenada in particular, when sugar proved to be no longer viable, British interests turned to another one-crop economy, bananas. That too is now dead. Production in both these sectors was based on low wages and poor conditions of work. While British companies benefited first from Commonwealth preferences in the UK market, and then preferences in the European market after Britain joined what was then the European Economic Community, workers in the Caribbean remained poor, with all the consequences that flows from poverty. In 300 years of empire, Britain did not diversify or industrialize Caribbean economies. It is what, for instance, led to the Financial Times article to which reference was just made, and indeed to whose composition I contributed. Now, in the post-independence period, Caribbean countries have sought to diversify their economies and their trade. But these efforts have suffered from the need for vital infrastructure and from the absence of transportation links to markets. For instance, there are no direct transportation links by sea between the Caribbean and Africa. And even direct transportation links to the neighboring Latin American and Central American countries are non-existent. Such transportation links as exist are based on the colonial model in which to get to Africa, Asia, or the Pacific, the route is through Britain with all its attendant additional costs making trade in goods difficult and expensive. Today, Caribbean countries face chronic problems, among them shortages of productive capital, high structural unemployment, trade and balance of payments deficits, and in many of them, high levels of debt. I turn now to another aspect of the bad, divided societies. In Guyana and Trinidad and Tobago, two of the larger former British colonies in the Caribbean, their politics and their development have suffered from the racial divisions between their two major ethnic groups: Africans transplanted as slaves and East Indians transported as indentured laborers as a bulwark against any bargaining power that freed African slaves might have been able to muster after the abolition of slavery. Dr. Eric Williams, a noted historian and a former Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, described the reality of independence for these countries as, and I quote him, "seeking to deal with our problems on a national scale and in an international context with a mentality conceived in slavery, cradled in indenture, and nurtured in colonialism." The racial division, which is a direct result of British colonial policy of divide and rule, continues to frustrate the politics and governance of these two major countries in the English-speaking Caribbean and retards their development. Now, another bad feature of empire in the Caribbean was the acquiescence of the British government in the plantocracy's determination over 300 years to maintain the countries of the region as separate enclaves of influence. And we must remember that there was at one point in this country's history when its parliament was made up of people who owned sugar estates in the Caribbean and derived their power and influence from it. In any event, when in the 1950s the separateness tried to be overcome by local leaders, it is arguable, and I say arguable, that the British government's abandonment of the Federation of the West Indies, which lasted from 1958 until 1962, by offering first Jamaica and then Trinidad and Tobago the opportunity of independence individually, assured for the future the weak and vulnerable region that we now have. While the British government's action was not the sole contributor to the breakup of the West Indies Federation, the seeming desire to be shed of its Caribbean colonies resulted in the creation of what is now 12 independent states, many with populations of less than 100,000 people, and each struggling to survive at various levels as sovereign states beset with high levels of crime, including drug trafficking from South America to Europe and North America, high rates of unemployment, no economies of scale for production, low rates of technical knowledge, and little capacity to bargain in the international community. Now I turn to the ugly. African slavery and East Indian indentured labor were the mainstay of cheap production of sugar from the Caribbean that contributed for centuries to the wealth, growth, and development of Britain. In 1838, when slavery was abolished by Britain, British slave owners in the English-speaking Caribbean received £11.6 billion in today's value as compensation for the emancipation of their property. And what was their property? 655,780 human beings of African descent that they had enslaved and exploited. The freed slaves, by comparison, received nothing in recompense for their dehumanization, their cruel treatment, the abuse of their labor, and the plain injustice of their enslavement. The monies paid to slave owners have been studied and assembled by a team of academics from University College London, including Dr. Nick Draper, who spent 3 years pulling together 46,000 records, which they have launched on an internet database. The benefits of those monies still exist in Britain today. For example, they are the foundations of Barclays Bank, Lloyds Bank, the Royal Bank of Scotland, and they are also the basis of wealth for many leading British and Scottish families. Dr. Draper is reported as saying, for instance, of the Hogg family, which had 2 Lord Chancellors in Britain in the 20th century, bearing the name of that slave-owning family, had property in Guyana. They went there penniless. They came back very wealthy and contributed to the formation of a political dynasty which incorporated their name into enduring recognition. Now, the Hogg family were not unique. The wealth and political good fortune of 19th century British Prime Minister William Gladstone had its origins in the £83 million at today's value of compensation given to his father John Gladstone for slaves he owned in British Guyana and Jamaica. It was the same John Gladstone who introduced East Indian indentured labor in the Caribbean on his plantation of Reed and Hoop in Guyana to counter the capacity of freed slaves who were then able to bargain, and he intended to keep their wages dirt cheap. But it was not individual families alone that helped to create African slavery and that benefited from it. It was the British state as a whole. Successive governments provided subsidies for the slave trade. They adopted legislation that facilitated it, and they were complicit with the governments of their colonies in adopting laws that designated African slaves as real estate. In other words, people were stripped of their human identity, including life, and they were therefore to be treated like land, houses, and buildings. Remarkably, it was also the British state, including the British people, though I think if the British people had any say in it, they wouldn't have done it, who paid compensation to the slave owners while completely disregarding any obligation whatsoever to the 655,780 people who were enslaved and cruelly exploited up to that time. To do so, the British government borrowed £20 billion, which is £76 billion in today's money, from the Rothschild banking empire. And with that, they paid the slave owners. The sum amounted to about 40% of the country's gross domestic product at the time. British exploitation of people in the Caribbean did not start or end with the enslavement of Africans. For instance, Caribbean economic historian Hilary Beckles records the systemic elimination of the Kalanangos, the original people of the Eastern Caribbean islands. African slavery was followed in some Caribbean countries, Guyana, Trinidad, and Tobago in particular, by indentured servitude of people from India, bonded to an estate and its owners, deprived of normal liberties, subject to cruel and inhuman treatment. It was what the respected British historian Hugh Tinker described as another kind of slavery. When the vast majority of the original people of the Caribbean were near extinction, forcing the brutalized handful who remained into submission, when slavery was abolished with no recompense to the Africans for the deprivation of their liberty, the people of the Caribbean were left destitute, deprived, and disadvantaged. They got nothing by way of cash reparations to carry them into freedom. It is arguable that the Caribbean would today have been much further along the road of social and economic development if even half of the compensation given to slave owners had been given to slavery's victims 175 years ago. Several Caribbean governments today argue that there is a compelling case for reparations to the nations of the Caribbean on behalf of the people who were the victims of slavery. I don't believe that will go very far, but whatever happens with that campaign, the fact that African slaves in particular received no compensation for their captivity stands as one of the root causes of the underdevelopment of the region. Now let me turn to the remarkable very quickly, and I'll be through in a minute. In the Caribbean, one of the continuing legacies of empire is that Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth remains head of state and sovereign of 9 of the 12 now independent countries. It is true to say that an enduring regard and respect for Her Majesty exists among her citizens in these 9 countries, and it is significant that the most recent attempt to alter constitutional arrangements to change from monarchy to republic in St. Vincent failed at a referendum. This is undoubtedly due to the quality of Her Majesty herself, whose regard for the people of her realms is deeply appreciated and loyally reciprocated. Further, a relatively large number of people born in the Caribbean reside in Britain. They are more British in culture, in tradition, and in history than the people who are now here from the European Union. These ties contribute to keeping the Caribbean relatively close to Britain, as does present-day tourism and trade, all of it strengthened by common laws, similar education, and a shared language, English. Thank you.
Well, there's a practical cutting edge to that that could only help our discussion, and we have quite a few, well, thanks to the efficiency of our speakers, a good time left for discussion. If people could introduce themselves as they did this morning, and if participants can put their contributions in question form, it would help make sure that we get as many contributions in as possible. So the floor, please, is open. There's one over there.
Thank you. Wayne Mertes-Brown, counselling student. I'm really interested by what I just heard. I'm looking at what I've just heard from the perspective of my father, and this morning I hadn't heard a particular aspect of the legacy of empire, and that is when my father came here in 1952 and talks even today very passionately about the experience of the King's death and the Queen coming back from Kenya and how profound that was for him. He was surprised at the lack of warmth he felt when he came here, because he'd gone to school and every morning he'd stood to attention, and he was told if you didn't stand to attention, he got the cane when he would be required to sing the national anthem every morning. So he felt he was coming to the motherland, he was coming home. But home wasn't very welcoming. And I'm surprised that people were so ignorant of what was going on in the empire, what the empire existed of. And I'm wondering what your feelings are as to why that was. I would imagine today that the politicians and the spin doctors will be using what's going on very much better. Why wasn't it promoted? Why wasn't it a common practice to understand what was going on around the world in the name of Britain from a positive angle?
You wanted me to respond. This, of course, is a highly emotional issue. Many of the people who came here in the 50s, like your father, did believe that they were coming to a place that was the mother country. Britain was everything they knew. Their educational system was based on British history. We knew more about British history than we did about the history of the Caribbean or the people around us. And we had a great regard and respect for this country.
The microphone doesn't seem to be working.
Okay.
Yes.
Try that one.
In a nutshell, what I was saying is that this is, of course, a highly emotional issue, because people who came to Britain in the 1950s, like this gentleman's father, came here believing they were coming to the mother country. That is how they regarded Britain, because throughout their educational system, they learned British history, British literature. Shakespeare was second nature, and I think became very uncomfortable with the reception they received. Now, the truth of the matter is that it wasn't everybody that gave them that reception. We must remember that generalization about people is never a good thing, because it negates the individual. But I think in the time that West Indian immigrants have been here to now, we have seen them become integrated into society in quite a remarkable way. When I said at the end of what I said just now, that the people from the Caribbean who continue to live here are as British as the people who were born here, I think that is absolutely true. And one of the things this country now has to contend with is that it has people who are entering Britain who do not share British history, British culture, and British traditions in the same way that the people from the Commonwealth did. So it's going to be a test for Britain in the future. But I understand what your father went through, and I hope he's still alive and has now overcome all of that.
Well, just a quick one on Malta. I'd recently been out there and read a certain amount, and I gather, I think we all know, that during the war, more bombs fell on Malta than fell on London. They suffered tremendous hardships from the lack of food and nearly died of famine. My question is, did that was there a feeling of resentment towards Britain? After all, had we not been there with our navy, this wouldn't have happened. So I'd like your reaction to that.
Thanks. There were different resentments. At the same time that Malta was being awarded the George Cross for bravery in 1942, scores of Maltese nationalists or suspected nationalists, including many dockyard workers, were being deported illegally and unconstitutionally to Uganda without trial or charge. So that certainly caused a lasting resentment, which is still felt today. But I think the general feeling during the war was that Britain and the Allies were fighting a just war. Don't forget that Malta had tasted the war because when Benito Mussolini decided to side with Hitler, the first object of the first ever air raids on Malta were on Malta, 10th of June 1940. So for the first time, people in Malta actually saw these war machines in the air and went out to look at them, thinking they were going to throw flowers or to see what they looked like, and were being sent to their graves. That was, I think, that gave people an inkling of what they were up against. So on the whole, I would say that the war, rather than causing resentment, of course, a lot of people got killed. Malta, as you say, was the most bombed place on earth. But people generally went through the war with enormous perseverance and faith. I have uncles who are on the anti-aircraft guns, for example, and so on. And it was, I think, on the whole, something of a common effort. With the victory kitchens, and there was a lot of organization and mobilization because it was a question of survival. So I suspect that rather than resentment, that joint effort helped the Anglo-Maltese relations to gel. And I don't think that Mintoff's referendum on his proposed integration with Britain plan in 1956 would have obtained the majority of those voting had it not been for this post-war bonding. Of course, then it changed, starting with himself, because then he decided that he wanted the opposite.
Derek Smith. Whilst I agree that there can be no doubt that the establishment of the sugar industry in the Caribbean was done for the benefit of the United Kingdom, and that the widespread clearing of land and so on for it caused great environmental damage, and then the collapse of the industry, largely I think due to the British subsidisation of beet sugar, has left vast areas desolated, and it's left the economies not diversified in the way they did. But accepting all that, would you also agree that to some extent there was a change in approach at governmental level anyway in 1945 when the government woke up to some of the problems of the West Indies and basing themselves on the recommendations of the Royal Commission to the West Indies in the late 1930s, and the report had been suppressed during the war, that from 1945 onwards there was a real attempt through development schemes financed with colonial development and welfare funds to try and improve the infrastructure and also to diversify the economy to some extent. Thank you.
I would agree with you that after the Royal Commission of Inquiry, in fact there was one that preceded that, as you said, got halted during the war, that there was a significant attempt by the British government to improve conditions, particularly labor conditions in the Caribbean. What didn't happen was the building of infrastructure. The Caribbean was left, for instance, without ports, without seaports, without airports as well. One of the huge problems that the Caribbean community now has as a trading group is that there are no transportation links between them. There are countries with small airports that can't take big planes, yet they depend upon tourism to survive, because bananas has now gone out of the equation because of what's happened in the European Union over that. And the World Trade Organization saying that preferences from the European Union to the Caribbean are no longer acceptable. Caribbean ports were built after Britain left the Caribbean. Take Guyana, for instance, where I was born. 83% of that country is still jungle. Everybody lives along the coastal strip, which coastal strip, incidentally, is on the sea level and constantly under attack from the Atlantic Ocean. When flooding occurs there, crops are wiped out overnight. Yet there was this vast interior that was never opened up. So the point I make about the lack of, Britain was in the Caribbean for 300 years. The point I make about the lack of infrastructural development is a real one. Now, in fairness to Britain, let me also say that in the post-independence period, the Caribbean could have wanted no greater friend than Britain in terms of aid and technical assistance to help develop it. And up until recently, that was still the case. So that, there has been some attempt by enlightened governments in the post-war period to help to do something in the Caribbean. The problem is that the problems were huge. We now have modern societies that have the internet, television, all of these things available to them, and they see a life outside of the Caribbean to which they too aspire. And how do you match that aspiration with the level of development you have is a very, very difficult proposition. So in part, that's the legacy that we've been left with. And it's a legacy that we've got to try to battle with. And I should say that in our relations with the European Union, the country upon which we have been able to depend as a friend has been the United Kingdom. Because there are, of course, many countries now in the European Union who have never had any relationship with the Caribbean, and therefore couldn't care less whether it existed or not. But to that extent, the United Kingdom remains a loyal friend, and I think for that we are grateful.
Two questions, one first one there, one over there, but to begin.
James Foster. I only know the Caribbean having spent a week in Antigua. But one thing that amazed me, it was at one time sugar. The people therefore have, whether they like it or not, a farming background. But until the last year or so, there wasn't a single vegetable grown there, and all the vegetables that the hotels used all had to be imported. Now, I mean, that might be some diversification because possibly the area could be used for farming of some sort. but there seemed to be an ingrown sort of feeling that the people of Antigua didn't want to get involved in agriculture again. Now, this is several generations since they had been indentured labour or slaves. And it's nothing to do with the empire, but it's something to do with the local politicians. It's all very well to blame Britain for something that happened 60 or more years ago. I come from Kenya, and I was sitting with the town clerk of Kisumu, and he said, it's all your fault because you don't have any water in your hotel. And I said, well, it's 50 years since the British left, and you've had, surely, in the last 30 years, enough time yourselves as intelligent people to do something about it. So, I mean, I'm not just having a go at the people of the Caribbean, but generally, you know, if people get cracking and do things, then things happen. But in Antigua, they certainly didn't seem to be.
Well, I'm very sorry that you've based all of that, all that you've said on 1 week in Antigua. Nonetheless, I hope you did enjoy your stay there. But let me tell you, Antigua, when the British colonized it, was a very lush island. Every single tree on the island, except for a very small area, was cut down. Every single tree. And the entire island was turned to sugarcane cultivation. People were not allowed to grow any food, because if they grew food, they became independent of the plantation. The plantation owners imported all the food from Florida. It was called victualizing the plantations. There was therefore no history of agricultural production on Antigua, except for sugar. Sugar actually didn't stop being produced in Antigua until 1975, sir, when the bottom fell out of the sugar market. The country was entirely dependent on sugar until 1975. The fact that people don't go into agriculture today has to do with Antigua has no rainfall. And the reason it has no rainfall is because it has no trees to attract rain. Now, it makes it very attractive as a tourism destination, but not if you want to have a bath. So the point I'm making to you is that these were conditions created. It is not a natural feeling of Antiguans that they don't want to grow food. The other aspect of it is that the Americans subsidize all of their agricultural production. It is therefore cheaper to bring food from Miami to Antigua than to try to grow it in Antigua, where the cost of the inputs, insurance, fertilization, and all of that, and irrigation in a country where water has to be imported several times a year, is simply does not make management or economic sense.
There's a question. Thank you. My name is Gordon Bridger. I'm an economist and I worked for about 40 years on foreign aid programs. I'm not going to comment on economic conditions or circumstances of the 19th century, although I think perhaps isn't it worth recognizing that Britain was the first country to go for the liberation of slaves in the world. And in fact, slavery was endemic throughout the world, even in Europe until the 19th century. So isn't there some recognition which Britain and its people should get for the tremendous efforts which they did make to abolish the slave trade? As far as economic development of the Caribbean is concerned, the problem is these islands are small, they are resource poor in that sense, well, people are extremely dynamic and active, but in fact it's extremely difficult to develop in a multi-purpose fashion such small economies. And there always has been a tremendous amount of aid since about 1960, not only from Britain but from the EC and everybody. So capital funds have never really been short in the Caribbean, and I think if you look at the figures of aid now, you'll probably find they're bigger than they ever have been before. But I'd be very interested in your comments on Britain's historical decisions about the slave trade. Thank you.
I'll answer that in one way. I think the British person living in Britain and the slave would always see slavery differently. And unfortunately, that legacy remains today. And I don't think I need to add anything further to that.
Well, we have. I think we have to end, don't we, Philip? We do. I'm being told that we have to end. We're bang on the dot, and we're going to move directly to the next session on the United Kingdom. But before we do, thank you. We will applaud both our excellent speakers. Thank you.